Okay, let's get into a really provocative work, Manufacturing Consent by Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky. This isn't just a book about media theory.
Not at all. It's a fundamental challenge to this belief we have, this idea that a free press will, by its very nature, keep power in check.
Right. It completely flips that idea on its head.
It does. And our goal here is to really understand the core of the book, which is their analytic tool they call the propaganda model.
The book came out in 1988, so it's looking back at the post-Vietnam, post-Watergate period.
Exactly. And they're asking this really powerful question. Why does the U.S. news media, which is supposedly adversarial, so often seem to reinforce elite interests, especially when it comes to things like foreign policy?
And their core thesis is, well, it's pretty startling. They argue that major media outlets in the U.S. act less like a watchdog for the public.
And more like a profit-driven machine, a system that's designed to manufacture our consent to get us on board with certain narratives.
And it's not a conspiracy. That's the critical part.
Absolutely. As the authors explain it, this isn't about some centralized censorship board. It's a structural theory. The outcome is predictable simply because of how the system is built, how it's funded, and who it serves.
So let's talk about the structural argument, because I think that's the big intellectual leap the book makes.
It really is. As commentators have pointed out, the book changes the question entirely. We stop asking, why did the media get this one story wrong?
And start asking something different.
Right. We start asking, given that media companies are huge corporations, what kind of news would we expect them to produce?
So you're saying we should look at a major news network not as a civic body, but just another corporation.
That's the move. The book places media inside the exact same market system as any other big business. And that dependence, as they specify, means its apparent freedom actually hides a much deeper alignment with economic and political power.
Which is how they sidestep that whole conspiracy theory accusation.
They get ahead of it immediately. They're not saying a handful of people meet in a secret room.
They have backroom deals.
No. The model argues that propaganda just emerges. It comes out of the day-to-day incentives. If you need government sources to meet deadlines, and you need corporate advertisers to stay afloat, you will naturally start filtering your own content. It's almost a law of physics for information.
Okay, so that's the framework. Now let's break down the mechanics. The core of the book is these 5 filters, these structural constraints.
Right, these 5 gatekeepers that decide what information becomes news and what gets left behind.
So what's filter number 1?
Filter number 1 is ownership. As the book details, the major media outlets are massive profit-seeking corporations, but the key is that they're often part of even larger conglomerates.
So the company that owns the news channel might also own, say, a defense contractor or a major bank.
Exactly. So the interests of the people at the top of the news organization are directly tied to the very systems they're supposed to be investigating. As Herman and Chomsky put it, the moment a news outlet's main goal becomes shareholder value, its allegiance shifts.
Which sets a clear boundary on what can be said.
An immediate one. And that leads directly into filter number 2, advertising.
If ownership is about who you work for, advertising is who foots the bill.
And this might be the most powerful filter of all. For many outlets, advertising makes up the vast majority of their revenue. So the book's key insight is that the product being sold isn't the news.
The product is us, the audience.
That's it. We are the product packaged and delivered to the real customer, the advertiser. So this creates a powerful incentive to produce content that won't upset those advertisers, content that generally supports consumerism and a business-friendly environment.
It's like a restaurant that can only serve food approved by its biggest supplier.
That's a perfect analogy. Now, filter number 3 is about the raw material of news. It's called sourcing.
And this one is about efficiency, isn't it? It's just too expensive to do a deep investigation for every single story.
It is. The book really highlights this structural reliance on institutional sources. News organizations depend on a constant, steady stream of information from government bodies, corporate PR departments, and so-called expert think tanks.
Because it's cheap, it's reliable, and it's already vetted.
And it gives those institutions incredible power to set the agenda. They become what the authors call the primary definers of the news. If you can flood the system with your version of events, that version becomes the default story.
And if a journalist tries to push back against that default story?
Well, that's where you get filter number 4, flack.
And flack isn't just a few negative comments online.
No, this is organized, coordinated negative feedback. It's meant to discipline any outlet that steps too far out of line.
So what does that look like in practice?
It can be political pressure from the top, advertiser boycotts, organized letter-writing campaigns from powerful lobby groups, and maybe most effectively, the threat of very expensive lawsuits. The mere possibility of flack makes an editor think twice.
It's the cost of doing real adversarial journalism.
It is. And that brings us to the final one, filter number 5, the ideological filter. This is the one that sets the whole tone.
It defines the good guys and the bad guys.
Precisely. Back when the book was written, the main ideology was anti-communism. It was the ultimate bad guy.
But that's obviously shifted.
It has. And as later commentators explain, that filter proved to be very adaptable. It became anti-terrorism or anti-immigrant sentiment or anti-socialism. It's a national fear that defines the absolute boundaries of acceptable debate. Anything outside of that is labeled as dangerous or disloyal.
So these 5 filters, ownership, advertising, sourcing, flack, and ideology, they work together.
They do. They create a system that automatically selects for certain kinds of news and frames it in a certain way long before it ever gets to you.
And to prove this wasn't just a theory, they did these incredibly detailed case studies. The most famous one is how they distinguish between worthy and unworthy victims.
This is really the heart of the book's evidence. It's a powerful demonstration. They looked at how U.S. media covered atrocities in enemy countries, say a Soviet-backed state.
And they compared that to coverage of similar, or even worse, abuses happening in countries that were U.S. allies.
Right, like certain regimes in Central America at the time. And the results were just stark.
A completely different kind of coverage.
Completely. When a victim suffered under an enemy regime, they were a worthy victim. Their story got intense, emotional, sustained coverage. It generated outrage.
And that outrage could then be used to justify U.S. policy against that enemy.
That's the function. But if a person suffered the same abuse under an allied government, they were an unworthy victim. Their story was downplayed, rationalized, or most often just completely ignored. The moral outrage was gone.
So it's not random error, it's a predictable pattern.
It points to a deep structural bias that aligns news coverage with foreign policy goals. And they found similar patterns in how elections were covered, legitimizing U.S.-backed candidates while delegitimizing their opponents.
The strength of the model, then, is that it connects all these different dots.
That's its power. It provides one coherent framework that explains how ownership, sourcing, and ideology all lock together to produce this very consistent pattern. Even critics of the book often use the 5 filters as a starting point for their own analysis.
Which is a good transition. The book was massively influential, but it also faced some serious criticism. We should definitely get into that.
Of course, no model is perfect. The first major critique is often a charge of over-determinism.
Meaning it suggests the system is all-powerful with no room for resistance.
Right. Critics argue that the model can make it seem like propaganda is just a one-way street, that structural pressure equals total control. It can downplay the agency of individual journalists.
And we do see examples of incredible investigative journalism from major outlets that challenge power. How does the model account for that?
That's the core of the criticism.
Yeah.
Does the model just write those off as exceptions? Or are they proof of real countervailing forces within the system like journalistic integrity that the book understates?
Okay, and the second criticism is that the mechanisms, the filters themselves, are sometimes a bit vague.
That they're underspecified. Commentators argue that some of the filters, especially the ideological one, are described so broadly that you could almost make any news coverage fit the model after the fact.
Which opens it up to confirmation bias. You find what you're looking for.
Exactly. It makes it harder to test as a truly scientific, falsifiable theory.
And the third major point from opponents is about the pluralism of media. They'd say the media landscape is much more diverse than the book suggests.
They point to nonprofits, independent media watchdog groups, and say the model doesn't give enough credit to these forces that push back against the mainstream narrative.
And all of this gets even more complicated when you bring it into the digital age.
It really does. The rise of social media and algorithms both confirms and complicates the original model in fascinating ways.
So how does it confirm it?
Well, ownership and advertising are more powerful than ever. Tech giants like Google and Meta are the new conglomerates, and their entire business model is selling our attention to advertisers. Their algorithms tend to prioritize established institutional sources over costly independent work. The basic mechanics are still there.
But the complication comes from what?
The sheer chaos of it. The fragmentation of the audience is one thing, but the bigger change is the nature of flack. Now, instead of an organized letter-writing campaign, You can have a decentralized mob of millions of accounts aiming to discredit a journalist overnight. The power is still concentrated, but the attacks are everywhere.
So if the system tends to privilege the views of elites, that has to have some major ethical implications, right?
Massive ones. The book's ethical core is that if the information system is skewed, then the people with the least power, workers, marginalized groups, people in other countries, their stories are the ones that get filtered out.
And if we just apply a simple golden rule test to that?
Would you want your story, your reality, to be consistently ignored in the debates that determine your future? The answer is obviously no. The book connects the dots between how the media is structured and who ultimately pays the price.
Let's tie that back to some foundational civic ideas, like from the preamble. For example, form a more perfect union.
The book warns that if our public consensus is built on manufactured ignorance, not informed debate, then that union is incredibly fragile. You can't have genuine solidarity without a shared set of facts.
What about establish justice and promote the general welfare?
Well, if the media systematically ignores the harm done to vulnerable people, let's say pollution caused by a major advertiser, then how can our public policy possibly be just? You can't fix an injustice if you're structurally discouraged from even seeing it.
And finally, secure the blessings of liberty. It's so ironic that the free press, the institution meant to protect liberty, could actually be undermining it.
That's Herman and Chomsky's deepest concern. That our formal freedoms, like freedom of the press, can become hollow. If the range of acceptable thought is quietly narrowed by these structural pressures, then our ability to make truly free and informed choices is constrained. The liberty is on paper, but the tools to use it are missing from the mainstream.
I think the most important thing for anyone listening is how this book gives you a practical toolkit for thinking critically about the news.
It absolutely does. It's an invitation to stop taking news at face value and to start analyzing the system that produced it. You can use the 5 filters as a checklist for every story you see.
So when you see a major headline, you stop and ask those questions. Who owns this outlet?
Who's paying for it through advertising?
Which sources are being quoted? And maybe more importantly, which sources are missing?
Who is generating flack around this story to try and control the narrative?
And what's the overarching fear, the enemy story that frames the entire issue?
Asking those 5 questions gives you critical distance. And that leads to the final and I think most important thought. The model shows how systems are shaped by powerful incentives, yes. But recognizing those constraints is the first step toward exercising your own agency. We as citizens still have the power to resist, to seek out other sources, and to support alternative spaces for truth. The critique is not a reason for despair, it's a call to action.